So, David, we recently hosted a discussion forum with some UK higher education institutions where we were discussing the issues of data sharing internationally. So, what do you think higher education institutions need to think about when planning an overseas transfer of personal data?
There's an awful lot to think about when you're planning. Transfer risk assessment, for example, privacy notice or privacy notices to inform your people, your data subjects, legal bases, because if we don't have our legal bases, then we're not going to move away from square one in the snakes and ladder game. Controller and processor roles and working out how those sit between the parties or participants in the project, and of course contracts. I think that a good place to start is with gathering the facts. A lot of the tasks in the list that I've just given you are actually quite specialist, and an HEI that has got that specialist capability within the organisation, great, you can crack on with that. But otherwise, where do you start if you're relying on general managers and general resource? Fact finding. If it was me, I would begin with the people. So whose personal data are we needing to transfer overseas? We need to think about everybody, is the first kind of stop point that I would, or discipline that I would impose on myself. So the project that you're trying to pull off might actually be centered on students. But we mustn't forget the management staff and the admin staff that are going to be putting it all together behind the scenes. They might be behind the scenes of the project in a sense, but their personal data is going to be moving overseas just the same as the student personal data. So we need a good, solid, well thought through list of all of the groups of data subjects whose personal data is going to go abroad. Then when we've identified the groups, the task is to work through each group and establish the facts about them. So we're talking about personal data. So what are the facts that we're interested in? It's going to be what personal data? What is it being used for in the UK and overseas, importantly? How is it going to be transferred? Is it a secure method? How is it going to be stored overseas? And what are the security measures that apply? And who will have access? These simple facts, structured by reference to the people, give us the kernel of information that we need in order to deliver all of those more technical tasks. We can start the risk assessment because we can now start to identify the risks. We can plan privacy notices. We can decide whether the UK higher education institution and the overseas party are both controllers or a mixture of controller and processors. And we can plan what obligations we expect each of the parties to meet in relation to personal data. So that's where I would start. Get factual, gather the facts, focus on the people, and then hand off to the specialists who can perform those technical tasks.
That's great. And you mentioned the controller and processor roles. And what does that mean in practice for most UK higher education institutions?
That's a really good question. And I've seen a lot of variations on the theme, but in most scenarios that I've come across, certainly working for UK higher education institutions, the basic position is that the UK institution and its overseas partner, whatever they are, an HEI or something else, they're often both controllers. Now, as I say, I'm not stating that as a general rule, but it is very often where we end up in projects that UK higher education institutions pursue and that involve a significant amount of personal data transfer overseas. It's the case, for example, for flying faculties. It's the case for overseas campuses. It's very much the case for student exchange. And definitely, but this is a complicated one, for international student recruitment as well. And they're the main scenarios that I have in mind here when I make this comment. This has quite a significant operational impact for both the UK higher education institution and the overseas partner. Even though we might conclude that they're both controllers, that doesn't make it like falling off a log. So the UK HEI particularly, but perhaps both parties, is going to need to prepare privacy notices for the UK data subjects, and maybe for the overseas data subjects as well, members of staff of the partner organisation, for example, the overseas students that are coming into the UK. And almost implicitly, what we're going to have here is a little bit of collaboration and talking through between the two parties, the UK HEI and its overseas partner, so that we both know what the footprint of personal data is that is involved from each side, and how it's going to be used in each country or location where the personal data is going to be used. So there's that initial collaboration, and often that collaboration or set of conversations will need to be facilitated by a data protection expert, because we are fundamentally talking about personal data. And the reason for the collaboration and the discussions is to make sure that we can prepare compliant documents like privacy notices and contracts. So the whole conversation needs to be geared to working out what the compliance touch points are, what the compliance headaches are. The two parties will in particular, and this tends to be complicated in HEI overseas transfer scenarios, the two parties will need to work out the time or the stage in their process and their method for providing privacy notices to the relevant data subjects. It's often not straightforward. If you think about having to get a single message out to perhaps several hundred people or more in a consistent way, and establishing a mechanism that ensures that the privacy notice is available to those people and is in fact provided to those people, it can be difficult. So if we think about international student recruitment, that's a particular headache case, because typically what you have there is not just one organisation that is doing the recruitment. You might have a single organisation that is managing at the centre of the hub, but around it you have a huge network of essentially freelancers. How do we ensure that an international network of freelancers operating across a number of jurisdictions that have no data protection law whatsoever and don't understand our compliance language, how do we ensure that they provide our compliance documents at the right time to the right people? That is a really difficult management task and requires considerable thought to make sure that the mechanism is in place and workable.
Thanks very much for your time, David.
My pleasure.